Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, host of Thinking Aloud. Our topic today is the Sanskrit tradition. My guest is Dr. Dean Brown, a theoretical physicist, Sanskrit scholar, entrepreneur, and translator of the Upanishads and the Yoga Sutras. Welcome, Dean.
I'm very glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, I think many people who speak English don't realize that our own language, as well as most Western languages, have their origins in what is sometimes called the Proto-Indo-European language, which is really the same language from which Sanskrit and the Hindu traditions are derived.
Yes, English, Russian, Icelandic, French, Greek are all dialects of a mother tongue that's spoken very widely in India and many parts of the world.
We think of ourselves as being Western, and we think of India and its culture as being Eastern, but actually they have not only a common linguistic origin, but a common cultural basis as well.
Yes, common thought. If we divide East and West, I would put the boundary between India and China, perhaps. But India is Western, by my way of thinking.
Well, and Buddhism, which was born in India and then moved to China, bridges that gap as well.
So Buddhism is the West that went to the East.
There we have an example of how we're much more intimately related to Eastern culture than we think, and many, many, many words in the English language have Sanskrit origins, or origins that are traceable to the Sanskrit tradition in the earlier Proto-Indo-European language.
Oh yes, most of the words in English, say, go back either through the Teutonic Northern European Icelandic route to the Sanskrit or the Vedic, and then through the Mediterranean route, the Romance route.
Now we think of Sanskrit as a language of mysticism, a language of the Bhagavad Gita, of the Yoga Sutras, of the Vedas, the language in which there's the great equation, Atman equals Brahman. Let's start there. Maybe we can, you could elaborate on that.
Well, Sanskrit's an artificial language spoken in the wisdom traditions and in the great hymns. The language spoken in the street in ancient times would be called Vedic. Vedic is a vernacular, and Sanskrit is a synthetic language. Just like the Latin that Julius Caesar spoke would be vernacular, but the Latin that we have in medicine and law and botany and the church is not the street language.
So Sanskrit was a formal language used by the priests and by the philosophers of ancient times.
Yes. And it is very beautiful, but it wouldn't give you much of an idea of what's actually spoken in the bazaar.
But there's a lot of abstractions that we find in Sanskrit that have permeated our modern idiom. Concepts like karma, concepts like Brahma.
Yes, that's why we think of Sanskrit as a scientific language.
Mm-hmm.
The terms in Sanskrit are so precise that they're used in the street today in California, for instance, because the English equivalents don't exist.
There are many, many words in Sanskrit that describe states of consciousness.
States of consciousness, thinking, mentality. There are other languages that have feelings in them, but Sanskrit has precision for thought and consciousness.
And metaphysics.
And metaphysics, yes.
And cosmology. Itself. Now, you've translated the Upanishads, very ancient and revered sacred texts. You have described to me how these texts are really to be chanted. They're like poetry in a way, and yet they have a precision to them. Could you read one of those?
Yes, there are a couple hundred Upanishads known today. And when the rishis, the teachers, started teaching the Upanishads to the Western scholars a couple hundred years ago or 150 years ago, they were very open in chanting them at first, and then they realized that if they're written down, they lose some of the power. So only about 100 of them have been written, and the rest are still in the verbal tradition.
Orally
oral
transmitted,
tradition,
memorized.
which is the origin of all wisdom, is in the oral tradition. But to give you an idea of some of the melody in these documents, I picked the beginning of the Isha Vashapanishad, which goes like this. Om,
the sound of the universe.
the sound of the universe, from which we get our modern word of human, Om. Humble. Full that. Full this. From the full, everything has come out. Having taken everything out of it, the full alone remains. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace. In the world, whatsoever changeful is, all this with the Lord should be enveloped. By that renunciation, support yourself. Do not covet the wealth of anyone. Only for performing good deeds should one desire to live 100 years. Only thus and in no other way will your work not have stains.
It actually is in some ways reminiscent of the Old Testament. Don't covet things, do good.
Oh yes, the ideas are the same. There is a universal ethic.
But then there's something a little deeper in there about non-attachment.
Oh yes, the ideas have many layers of meaning. They just go on and on. You can take one of these sutras and dig in it forever. The word sutra is interesting. It's the same word that we have in the hospital. If you sew up a wound, suture. A sutra means a string of pearls. So these ancient poems are called sutras. They're strings of pearls.
They're really like
They're tied together.
nuggets of wisdom.
Nuggets of wisdom, right.
In a way.
And that's why I read it with pauses between the lines, because each line has multiple meanings, and if you pause, it sinks into the subconscious more.
Now, I think it's very interesting what you said earlier about the word human. We're all human, but very rarely do we pause to think, what does that word mean? And here you've traced it to a Sanskrit root, Aum, or which is the eternal sound of the universe.
The eternal sound from which the universe is expressed. So everything that's in the universe is human. Everything that's alive is human. Homo sapiens, among other things, is human, but we won't be around very long. Humanity will prevail long after Homo sapiens has been forgotten.
And the Vedic tradition is one that has this sense of eternal cycles.
Lots of time. Yes, in the Veda there are epochs of time that come and go like a big wheel. We're coming to the end of an epoch right now, which is one of the worst ones. And
the Kali Yuga.
The Kali Yuga. And we'll come around to a better time.
Yeah.
If you don't like these times, hang on. Better times are coming.
Well, it's interesting to me, Dean, you had a career in theoretical physics, and many theoretical physicists, such as yourself, have studied the Sanskrit tradition. Many of the great physicists have made a point of it.
Yes, physicists like the Sanskrit tradition because the cosmologies that were written down, how the universe came about, apply pretty much today.